you ever get the feeling television isn't what it used to be?
So no. Brexit means Brexit.
We had to take a compulsory course called Combat Propaganda.
Boris Johnson once declared that his life's ambition was to be king of the world.
Does Yevgeny Lebedev have any connection with the Russian spy machine? Well, yes.
Find deeply offensive. Where is the evidence?
I don't care if they find it offensive.
The fundamental problem with Facebook is that it is accountable to no one.
The government was advised to invest money in the NHS. The government aren't listening to the evidence.
The kind of world I want to bring my child into.
And it's Friday night with Byline Times. I'm Peter Jukes.
And I'm Hardeep Matharu. And over the next hour, we'll bring you what the papers don't say.
And what the TV doesn't tell you. Now tonight, the whole programme is dedicated to a story very close to my heart, and I believe close to the heart of the corruption which currently infects the British state and its media operatives. And I'm talking about the story of Daniel Morgan, murdered 34 years ago in a South London car park. I'll be joined tonight by Alastair Morgan, who's conducted a 34-year campaign to get justice for his brother after 5 failed murder investigations, and by Kirsteen, who has led the Justice for Daniel campaign. But before that, we'll also be joined by the Guardian journalist Nick Davies, who broke the amazing story of the phone hacking scandal, and he'll be telling us how that connects to the murder of Daniel Morgan and what Priti Patel, the Home Secretary's recent blockage of the Daniel Morgan independent panel report, tells us about the proximity between senior politicians and Rupert Murdoch.
Now, Byline TV isn't funded by hedge funds or billionaire proprietors. It's funded by our supporters. So if you haven't signed up yet, you can do at patreon.com/Byline TV. You can also sign up on Byline TV on YouTube, as Jake just has. Thanks very much, Jake. And if you do sign up, you can join us after this show. We'll be holding an exclusive Q&A with Alastair Morgan and Kirsteen, and we'll be discussing more of the issues after dark. Now, the murder of Daniel Morgan, a private detective, in 1987 in a pub car park in Sydenham in southeast London remains unsolved to this day. Although numerous charges have been brought against suspects, no one has ever been convicted of the crime. It's a complicated story, but it's one that really matters, because it not only does it raise questions of institutional corruption at the heart of the police and criminal elements within the press, there's also a human tale, the impact, the cost of what happens when citizens lose faith in the state. Now, as Peter said, he does have a personal connection to this story. He's one of the journalists who's been leading the investigations around the Daniel Morgan murder for a number of years now. He's written a book on the issue alongside Alastair Morgan, Daniel's brother, who'll be joining us very shortly. It's called Who Killed Daniel Morgan? Along with Divya Mayer, he also produced a hit podcast called Untold Murder, which had millions of downloads and was even mentioned recently on a primetime BBC show.
I must not have finished it.
Now, 8 years ago, the then Home Secretary Theresa May set up the Daniel Morgan independent panel to look into the investigation of the murder. It was due to report back in the last couple of weeks, and yet in the last few days we've had a disturbing development. The current Home Secretary Priti Patel has said that she needs time to review the report's contents, even though strictly speaking, with a panel report of this nature, her only job is really to present it to Parliament. And Peter, this is what leads our front page on Byline Times, our news site this week, doesn't it? Our headline, Beyond the Line of Duty, glossing over corruption. I mean, what have you made of just the very recent developments of the last few days?
Well, we'll talk to Alastair and Kirsteen about it soon, and I'm sure they would say it's just another one of those twists in a 34-year-long journey of the British state refusing to accept what it does. I was shocked by it, but what we've discovered since, as you know, and we published on that front page of Byline Times, is the Home Secretary is particularly close to Rupert Murdoch, who is going to be mentioned in this report, at least News International, and is now shuttered Sunday tabloid, The News of the World, which worked with this huge part of this report. And we discovered she was one of the 2 MPs at Rupert Murdoch's wedding to Jerry Hall, and that she met with Rupert Murdoch last September. And even today in court, it was mentioned that Priti Patel personally intervened with the South Hart in the, I think it's Bedfordshire Constabulary, in the blockading of Rupert Murdoch's print works by Extinction Rebellion. And it emerged in court. She personally rang the chief constable and said, you've got to do something about this. So we're back to that problem which Alastair and Kirsteen have faced for 34 years. And the tagline to our podcast when we first released it 5 years ago was, if you haven't heard this story, ask yourself why a story of police corruption, which also involves media corruption, is very difficult to tell.
And let's just very quickly go back to the beginning. I mean, how did you first become involved in this story?
Well, I mean, good we're talking to Nick, because it was his work on the phone hacking scandal and the amazing work he did bringing that to light from 2009 to 2011. And I was kind of working on that, and I realized this story thanks to people like Tom Watson, of Daniel Morgan. And I remember, it was 10 years ago now, ringing Alastair Morgan and saying, Alastair, do you want to talk to me about this? And he talked for a moment and he said, Peter, I'm so tired. I've talked enough about this. Can we talk again later? Fortunately, he did call back, and we did talk again. And it's a very, very moving story. An honourable man up against all odds.
And so many people will know the story because, my God, it has been 34 years. But there'll be plenty of people also coming to this anew. So just if you can break the basics down for us. What exactly happened in 1987? What has happened since? And where does this lead in terms of the panel report?
Well, it's always been difficult telling this story. It's partly media complicity. They don't want to tell it, but it's a complicated story. But let me just say one thing at the start. It's the most investigated murder in British history, we think. And after 5 investigations, millions of documents, police corruption in the original inquiry, it's going to be impossible to get a conviction on this. The family don't want another investigation. That's why they wanted this panel report.
So because the nature of police corruption, if there was a conviction and it was sort of proven that police corruption had played a part, this would potentially, open up the floodgates, is the argument.
No, it's more than that. That's certainly true. There's an element of reputational damage, limitation, the Meta doing. No, it's a brilliant defence, right? So if you are accused in the defendants, the people arrested over the Daniel Morgan murder, and there's original police corruption, they said, how do you know the police aren't corrupt now? And so anybody getting a fair trial can say that. And there's millions of, so many items of evidence. How could you ever get full disclosure?
So Daniel was a private detective. He was, as we've said, killed in 1987 in a pub car park in southeast London, in Sydenham. Just take us through sort of, what were the motives believed to be for the crime? What about the suspects? Were charges brought? Were there any trials? What happened?
Well, there's lots of red herrings here, planted by people around the murder who are adept at both fixing police files, fixing police investigations, and planting stories in the media. But I tell you what I believe happened. Daniel Morgan was going to expose the story of police corruption to the press in March 1987. He went to a meeting with his business partner in a pub which he never used to go to. He had been the night before.
And this is his business partner at the private detective agency?
Southern Investigations, a firm he set up. He's going for a very important meeting. He never parks his car in a darkened car park, but this time he does. And the back, very remote, even though it's in Sydenham, you can't see it, not overlooked. And he's hit 3 times to the back of the head with an axe. And the last blow is left as he's prone on the floor, is left in his cheek. He had 2 bags of crisps, which he bought for his kid, were left on the car park tarmac. Now what happens then is a police investigation which is incompetent, and even worse, what emerged later, arrests a few weeks later, one of the suspects at that time was the investigating officer. That first investigation collapsed. The officer, as had been predicted at the inquest, by the way, by a witness, the bookkeeper, takes Daniel's place in Southern investigation.
So this is the police officer who's investigating the murder.
Who is close to the last person to see him alive, which is his business partner.
Then essentially takes his place in the private detective agency.
Exactly. There's a second investigation into corruption, which they say they no evidence of corruption. From that point onwards, Southern Investigations becomes the one-stop shop for the dark arts of Fleet Street, which Nick Davies has.
Very briefly, just for the people who won't know what the term dark arts refers to.
I was just about to explain it. Southern Investigations led the way in bribing cops, corrupt cops for stories. In fact, Daniel's business partner was sent to prison in 2000 for using a corrupt cop to fit up a woman with cocaine in a custody dispute. But they also trained Mazhar Mahmood, the famous fake sheikh. They're behind some of the biggest scandals, the newspaper tabloid exclusives of the 90s. For example, if anybody remembers the Culture Secretary, David Mellor, who said the press in the early 1990s under John Major's government, the press are drinking in the Last Chance saloon. The apartment where he's having an affair with an actress is bugged up by Southern Investigations, and eventually he resigns. Paddy Ashdown, an opposition leader who's kind of up and coming, could have threatened the Conservative Party, made the front page of The Sun based on a letter stolen from his solicitors alleging he had an affair. That famous front page, Paddy Pants Down. Southern Investigations brokered that letter. They did computer hacking, they did early phone hacking, they got confidential records, they used the police computer, and they were really, I mean, Nick knows more, there's many others, but they were the heart of darkness in Fleet Street.
And so the press then, if I got it right, become part of the cover-up, essentially.
Well, they're implicated. So Southern Investigations work mainly for News of the World, but they also go over to the Mirror Group when the former editor of News of the World, Piers Morgan, employs them in the Mirror Group, Sunday Mirror and Daily Mirror. And then the worst thing of all, the most classic thing of all, I think, and I should get to Alastair and Nick Davies soon, is the last 2 murder investigations. This is a top level. There's been a third one, which is a bug is placed in Southern Investigations as part of a covert investigation in police corruption. And they discover 30 crimes with journalists. Then, when the 4th and 5th murder investigations are initiated, News of the World works to undermine them. They target the lead detective. They hack him. They get his confidential records. He is followed and surveyed by people in vans. And so the most extraordinary thing that News UK were confronted with the fact by the lead detective that they were undermining one of the top murder investigations in the country. And Rebecca Brooks did nothing. In fact, she promoted the people who were undermining the last 2 investigations.
It's, hearing just you outline it like that in terms of the press, it's pretty extraordinary how we've seen today the Times and some of the other tabloids line up to criticise the BBC. I mean, of course, certain concerns have been raised about the Panorama interview that Martin Bashir conducted with Diana, many years ago. But it's really interesting to see, elements of the Murdoch press criticising the BBC when,
but the police have
they'll
looked at
never
that.
really turn that spotlight on themselves.
The police have looked at that and they said there's no crime committed. It's obviously unethical. It's wrong what Martin Bashir did, faking these bank records. But you cannot document the hundreds of crimes around, let's say, 5-month period, and they worked with News of the World, these people, for 21 years. In a 5-month period, they find 30 absolute crimes. So times that by 21, divide times again by 3.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary. And just very quickly, in terms of what the panel report, so currently it hasn't been published. The Home Secretary is saying she needs to review it. Do you have any hunch? I mean, I understand that no one has seen it, but do you have a hunch of what it might sort of say or make explicit?
Well, nobody's seen it, and of course, any hints that the family might know, they haven't seen it, they're sworn to confidentiality. My guess is that it will involve an allegation against the Met of institutional corruption in the same way, in maybe more devastating way, that the Macpherson report into Stephen Lawrence murder alleged institutional racism. But we'll talk to Nick about this, but who stopped the report? Who's kiboshed it for now? I don't think it's the Met. I think the Met have been dealing with the panel for 8 years. They maybe delayed it for a couple of years. But who's most likely? The person who will not know it and want to know what's in it would be News UK, Rebecca Brooks and Rupert Murdoch, because there's no way that panel report, even though, by the way, they have not, as far as I know, cooperated with the inquiry, they have kept silent. There's no powers of subpoena for an independent panel, whereas the Met have, eventually, it seemed, cooperated. So I think that's the pressure on the government now to hold it back.
Well, let's just take a very quick look at what the Home Secretary herself said about this today.
Well, I think it's important that I, as Home Secretary, actually receive the report before it is published. I have yet to receive this report, and I think it's right that I receive the report and read it before laying it in Parliament. That is standard practice when it comes to reports of this nature, and that is absolutely the right process to follow.
Well, I'm so happy in these dark circumstances to be joined by Nick Davies, who in a way, and he's to blame, inspired my career to move away from drama, which we've seen enough of on Line of Duty, to some really dark, true stories. Nick, thanks for joining us. So, do you want to start first about the connection between Daniel Morgan and the phone hacking scandal? Because it was around about the same time, wasn't it, that very, in a way, sadly for the Morgan family, the trial collapsed into the suspects in the Daniel Morgan murder in March 2011.
Take a step back. The key thing about Southern investigations, where Daniel Morgan worked with Jonathan Rees, is that they were involved with high-end professional criminals who were serving police officers. So in other parts of Fleet Street, newspapers were hiring private investigators who were committing criminal acts to get information for stories, but those criminal acts were quite low-key. I mean, hacking somebody's voicemail isn't a big crime. Jonathan Rees was involved with police officers who were subsequently convicted of setting up drug deals, setting up armed robberies. I mean, these are gangsters with police warrant cards. Right. If that's the starting point, you mentioned this, but just look in a little bit of slow motion detail of what is possibly the reason why Daniel was killed. That it is alleged, and we don't yet know the truth, and we don't know what the panel's found, that Daniel got fed up with the corruption around Southern investigations, which is basically around his partner, Jonathan Rees, and decided to go to a newspaper, which may have been the News of the World. The News of the World had a crime reporter, Alex Maranchak, who we know was very close to Jonathan Rees. Is it possible that it was Maranchak who grasped Daniel Morgan, who tipped off Jonathan Rees that his partner was about to expose this rat's nest of serious high-end police corruption? Did that lead to his death? So we don't know what this panel's found, but this goes on for years, this nexus between Rupert Murdoch's biggest selling newspaper and this really serious nest of police corruption. And the key thing is there are points along the track where it's completely obvious to everybody who's at a senior level in Murdoch's UK company that this nexus is operating. So for example, in June 2002, The Guardian, not me, somebody else, ran 3,000 word feature, which was based on that bug that you referred to that was placed into Jonathan Rees's office in 1999, and which detailed the corruption and the connection to the News of the World. So if you're running an honest news organization, and The Guardian's got this huge full-page feature about your corruption, you organize an internal inquiry, you make sure it doesn't continue, you get people sacked. As far as we know, none of that happened. It goes on. And then there's this extraordinary stuff. I mean, it's really serious, that this detective, Dave Cook, appears on Crime Watch, fronting the inquiry into this murder with these high-end criminals in the background. And we know that within 48 hours of Dave Cook's appearance on Crime Watch, Sid Fillery, the partner in Southern Investigations, telephoned Alex Marinchak at the News of the World, and they had a conversation in the course of which Marinchak agreed to, quote, sort him out. It's in the following week that Glenn Malcare, another private investigator working for the News of the World, contacted the Human Resources Department at Surrey Police, where this detective Dave Cook had previously worked, and pretended to be somebody from the Inland Revenue trying to send Dave Cook a tax refund in order to get his home address. And in the following week, this surveillance van turned up outside Dave Cook's house. He took the number, he checked. The surveillance van belongs to News International. It belongs to the News of the World. This is blinded, staggering stuff, that a newspaper acting on behalf of somebody who's involved with police corruption would take this kind of action to interfere with the detective who's trying to investigate a murder. So if the independent panel, having spent 8 years research, has been able to reinforce those allegations, if they've been able to follow it upstairs and show that senior people in the Murdoch empire knew about this, as surely they must have done, and yet took no action, that is extremely embarrassing.
There is, I'm sure you recall this too, just to follow up the 2002, Dave Cook, then superintendent on a very, very serious murder inquiry. I mean, this is like high-level murder inquiry. Then goes and confronts Rebecca Brooks at Scotland Yard, where she's attending a party for the commissioner then, John Stevens. And she confronts, why are you surveilling me? And we must remember that his wife at the time, Jackie Ames, was very traumatized by this because her friend, Jill Dando, who also worked on Crime Watch, had been killed, assassinated 3 years previously. What does Rebecca Brooks do? She says she'll look at it. She promotes Alex Marinchak.
Yeah, and the News of the World carry on using Southern Investigations as a source.
Well, and just one other thing, yes. Soon after that, Jonathan Rees comes out of prison. He's been sent to prison for perverting the course of justice. Andy Coulson hires him and he works him for the next 3 years. And then there's the last investigation, as we discovered, that was a top secret decision to initiate a fifth murder investigation in Blair, an inner sanctum. And before the family knew about it, Alex Marinchak and Jonathan Rees knew about the fifth murder investigation and started to see if they could undermine that too.
Okay, and a key point here is that the Murdoch network in the UK do know what the panel have been planning to say about them, because the law requires a panel like this to send letters to each of the people they're intending to criticize, listing in detail the criticisms that they're planning to make. Those letters went out earlier this year. So if senior people in the Murdoch network are on the receiving end of criticism, they know about it. So we live in a country which it is obsessed with official secrecy. Well, it's one of the most secretive nations in the developed democratic world. And this particular government, of course, reinforces its secrecy with habitual dishonesty. So we don't know at this moment. We have no idea who pushed Priti Patel's buttons. So we're left to speculate, and I acknowledge we're speculating. But it's reasonable to speculate that people in the Murdoch network must be worried by the contents of the letters that have been sent out earlier in the year, and have good reason to try to get the report stalled and redacted. The independent panel made it clear that their concern was that Priti Patel would get this report redacted, blanked out. And who in this country has the connections to push Priti Patel's buttons, to make her do something utterly inappropriate, as she has done?
So we can talk with Alastair and Kirsteen later about actually whether she can do that. But you have a great experience of the proximity of Murdoch appointees, his senior executives, his PR people, his lawyers, from 12 years ago when you started covering the phone hacking scandal, and the pressure put on you, put on your editor, Alan Rusbridger, the threats made towards you and private investigators targeting the editor. But didn't we, the good thing about Leveson 1, which is I put down largely to the work you did, some transparency about these prolific turnaround of meetings between Murdoch executives and senior politicians. In that case, David Cameron, George Osborne, these weird lobbyists around the culture minister then. What happened then, and do you think that provides a kind of pattern what might be happening now in behind the scenes?
So we know very well, partly from the Leveson inquiry, that Rupert Murdoch and at that time his son James, based in London, both had direct, unencumbered access to the most senior politicians in the country. So too did the chief executive of Murdoch's UK company, Rebecca Brooks, who is still in place. There are layers of contact, though, below that. So the Murdoch News Organisation, like some others, has often used its political reporters as ambassadors to carry messages, to ask for favours, to apply pressure. And we know from the Leveson inquiry, they also had a professional lobbyist. Do you remember this guy, Fred Michel? Who was all over the place and who had succeeded in getting a back channel of communication into the into the Secretary of State, Jeremy Hunt's Office of Culture and Media. So if we're speculating, as we have to because we live in a secret society, what would the Murdoch people have done if they had decided they didn't want the report to come out in its full form? I mean, these people are not stupid, and I would think that they will have learnt their lesson from Leveson not to make the contact too direct. So I can't rule it out. It is conceivable that Rupert Murdoch or Rebecca Brooks called Boris Johnson and said, speak to Priti Patel, get this sorted. And Priti Patel jumps when she's told to. You can't say that's impossible. But it is equally possible that they have been cleverer than that, having got caught out in the past, and will have used deniable intermediaries to send the message. And what we know, what's painfully true in this society is that when Rupert Murdoch sends a message to our allegedly democratic government, the government jumps. It doesn't need to be told twice that Rupert's unhappy about something. So I would love to know what happened behind the scenes that made Priti Patel make this extraordinary and obviously illegitimate move. And it's clear from the statement that was put out by the independent panel in response that there was a lot of heated argument during the 24 hours before she made that decision. So something pushed her. And I mean, if it was somebody senior in the Murdoch empire spoke to the Prime Minister, that's so outrageous, given that background of high criminality, to engage in the concealment of the exposure of that criminality, that it might just be one of those scandals capable of breaking through the walls of indifference and dishonesty that surround the government. I mean, it really ought to. Something very bad has gone on in the background here.
Nick, that is a brilliant analysis. And if you fancy it, stay on the line. And as we talk to Alastair and Kirsteen, you might have things to say. Unfortunately, because there's only 2 earpieces, any questions or statements you'll have to make, we'll have to relay to them. But if you can stick around, please do. Meanwhile, before we talk to Alastair and Kirsteen, just to get some idea of the human tragedy involved in this and the personal feelings and what happened to a family who had to fight this huge institutional indifference and corruption. Let's just look at a few minutes of the trailer we did for the podcast 5 years ago, which thanks to the crowdfunding of people like you, we managed to get made 20 episodes of Untold, the Daniel Morgan murder.
I never want to see those pictures. I sort of knew that if I looked at those pictures, that the images would be burned in my memory until the day I died, and I didn't want to have my last memory of my brother to be these awful pictures with an axe embedded in his face.
The Daniel Morgan murder, the most investigated murder in British history. A series of interviews with Alastair Morgan on his shocking 30-year journey.
He was attacked in the car park from behind, and I read the pathology report, and I could see that how they'd attacked him, that they'd first of all attacked him from behind, struck him from behind, and then as he fell down, he was struck on the top of his head with the axe, and then he fell on his back, and then while he was lying on the ground, obviously this final blow was dealt, which was just, it completely severed his brain stem. It was just frightful.
Within 2 years of Daniel's murder, Alastair knew he was facing a massive cover-up when he received a letter from the Police Complaints Authority.
Something like, there's no evidence whatsoever of police involvement, blah, 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 something like that.
But despite recalcitrance from the authorities, Alastair made a solemn vow to his dead brother.
And I can remember I walked out of my flat where I lived in this little village, really, in Hampshire, and there was a level crossing very close to my door, and I walked over the level crossing, and I can remember looking up the road and thinking, I'm going to get the people who did this to you, Daniel. I'm going to get them arrested, and I'm going to expose the corruption that I've seen here. I swear I'm not going to rest, until I've done that.
By the early 90s, Alastair felt the cover-up was so extensive, he trained to be a journalist in the belief that only the media could help.
The press, the media, would expose something like this because the system had failed me completely on every level. This is how I felt. The system has failed me on every level. What is there left?
Little did he know at the time, but the men suspected of involvement in Daniel's murder had, by then, formed a lucrative partnership with Rupert Murdoch's best-selling News of the World.
One of the big questions that remains now after 29 years is what exactly was the role of the Murdoch press in this case? How far does it go? How deep does it go? And when I look at it, all the indications are that I think, oh my God, this does not look good.
And Kirsteen Knight, thank you so much for coming and joining us. What's the last week been like for you both?
Well, it started on. We were getting ready to read the report, or for the publication of the report, and on the 17th, last Monday, and on the Tuesday before that, when is the 17th? I'm getting mixed up now with dates.
You're getting confused because it's been put back twice. So the first was just for reasons of the parliamentary grid being too busy, supposedly because of the death of the Queen's husband and other various things. So it was just an administrative delay. But then basically I went out to a Pilates class on Tuesday and came back to bombshell. Oh God, we've got an emergency panel meeting. What on earth can this be about? And we knew obviously it was something bad, and it was.
Yeah, we had an emergency Zoom meeting with the panel. Excuse me, and we were told that the Home Secretary had intervened. This is days before it was due to be published. And that she had insisted that she was going to have to see the report, read the report, and for national security reasons, and to check that it complied with Article 2, the right to life. In other words, people's safety, anyone involved in the report. And
that she may wish to.
And that she may wish to redact if she saw fit. Now, I mean, I thought that was outrageous. That we'd waited 8 years for this report, and then only days. This had all happened under the sort of umbrella of the Home Office. This report, it was financed by the Home Office. The panel members were agreed with my family, with the Home Office. They were appointed with our agreement with the Home Office, and then we're just getting ready for this report. Excited, apprehensive. What's it going to be like? What are we going to find out? And then this happened, and I mean, I suppose for me, after the initial shock and irritation and anger and frustration and all those feelings are bubbling up inside you, when this sort of kind of settled down again, I thought, well, I've been through 34 years of this, and if you've been through the similar situations before where inquiries have collapsed and one disappointment after another, when your expectations are built up and then boom, down it goes again. And on this occasion I thought, well, we've been through it all before. This is, this is nothing new. There's nothing new to us.
People were calling up and expecting you to be devastated and furious, and there was a certain amount of irritation, so I say, but people find it odd to find, we almost find it quite funny, because apart from anything else, it's just so bafflingly bewildering of why she would be doing this, because it's totally not within her powers, and I think she must have been badly advised.
Yeah. Because the whole point of the independent panel, set up by another Home Secretary,
is independent.
It's completely independent, and the process, if I get this right, Alastair, was that it's just sort of formally lodged with her, with the Home Office, for her to then publish, like a day. She gets to see it for a day. And the whole point of the independence, you can't redact anything, because like Hillsborough, this is an investigation where the government's gone wrong.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
police, or where our institutions have failed us.
And the police, the Met
And
comes under Home Office.
they've been working with the panel, haven't they? Specialists from the Metropolitan Police have been working with the panel to ensure that the report wouldn't endanger national security. And
the panel has always been concerned, because there are a lot of very dangerous people involved in and around the people, the suspects and the people they were associated with. There are some very dangerous people. So there has always been real concerns about the right to life, and nobody's life would be endangered by the publication of this report. So there is a QC working with the panel, who is part of the panel. They have a team of outside lawyers, by the way, which are used by the government all the time for other.
They wrote to me. Was it Friday? They wrote to me. So
Frankfield Fisher, well known for their work on public inquiries, and they also separately brought in a team of 5 police officers. 5 over 10
days.
For 10 days, who went through with a fine-tooth comb over all the potential national security issues. So
and right to life issues.
And right to life issues. So I'm confused as who Priti Patel will ask to do this review.
So it sounds like incompetence.
It sounds like that she was badly advised. Or confused with the Inquiries Act, where there would be those duties.
Right. The Inquiries Act, she would have powers. That way, you know about the Hardeep Inquiries Act. The Home Office would have a right to kind of review it, but there is no right to review.
God, I mean, it's interesting that you say that actually it's almost like a funny new development in this Kafka-esque style.
We've been through so many.
And I just, after all the frustration had boiled up and all the rest of it, I just thought, try and see. There's a funny side to it as well. I suppose, albeit a rather black, but I suppose it's a survival mechanism.
To be fair, to say, which isn't funny, it is not funny for Daniel's son, Daniel, who's flown in from Australia for the launch of this panel. So his life is being totally mucked around by this.
Yes,
and at a smaller level, we've all booked leave and are now on leave unnecessarily, and childcare issues for Daniel's daughter and son
so the whole family was supposed to be there when the
absolutely, there'll be a big press conference, and it'll be a big day.
When we talk about and I said this right at the start of the show, a story not just of institutional corruption within the police, within the press, but a human story, and about the impact of what happens when citizens lose trust in the state. I mean, for people watching who, you know, thank God haven't had to go through this experience, what do you say when I talk about the human cost and loss of trust? What does that actually equate to?
Well, I mean, this started at an early stage. You know, it started very quickly for me after with the police anyway, after the first, or very early on in the first investigation. And then I can remember by the time of the inquest, I was quite certain there was corruption. I had no doubt at all about it. And then and then there was an outside investigation. And once hopes are raised, you know, I think, oh yeah, it can't be this bad. It just can't be. You know, we can't allow this kind of stuff to go on. But
were you shocked at the prospect of corruption within the police, Alastair?
Initially, yes, particularly in something as serious as this. I was initially, I was just. I mean, I think probably for about the first year, I was in a state of shock. You know, I was just functioning on the outside, and then after the second investigation, which in my view was a complete whitewash, then I thought, no, this is just unbelievable. You know, I can't tolerate this. I can't live with this kind. Knowing, and I knew things were badly wrong. It wasn't just speculation. I'd seen things happening. I'd seen witnesses giving evidence at the inquest, and I was absolutely certain that corruption was going on. No doubt at all about it.
It may be just worth explaining that a little bit, because I was rereading the book about that moment that you kind of, Alastair says, very poignant thing, which is you knew there was dodgy people, including you didn't particularly like Daniel's business partner, and you went to one of the senior officers, in fact the same senior officer who took Daniel's place eventually, with your concerns in a way that upset you more, because you didn't trust some dodgy private detectives, but you did at that point trust them.
Do you mean at the very early?
Yeah, like that day three. This was
complete irony. That I went to an officer who was later arrested in connection with the murder, and explained my concerns about my brother's partner. You know,
who he then went into business with.
Who he then left and went into business with. It's just that.
So that sense of betrayal by the state was in a way deeper. And your sister, didn't it? Your sister Jane was particularly upset about that the police had let her.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, we were all utterly traumatized by this chain of events, and I mean, I suppose my confidence in the police at that point was absolute rock bottom. And then I started writing to my MP about it, and he didn't even bother to reply at the time. And then I later on moved to London, and then eventually I had an MP who would actually sit and listen to me, and then he and I began writing. Well, he wrote a whole series of letters. This went on for years, you know, to the Home Office, who just bounced them aside, you know.
I mean, how many years did it take you to get a meeting with the Home Office?
It took us, the family, 17 years just to get a meeting with the Home Office. So my confidence in parliamentary, you know, the parliamentary democracy was starting to seriously erode. And then the Met did a third, you know, under great pressure from my family, they carried out a third investigation behind our backs. And then I thought, oh God, you know, one provocation after, I regarded it as just one provocation after another. And I thought, I'm not going to step down, I'm not going to back down from this, you know. It was, you know, it was like kind of winding up a clock, you know, inside me. You know, and you're getting more and more frustrated and more tense and more angry and more depressed as well. Feeling this is not happy, you know, kind of feeling of this can't be right, this can't be true, you know, they can't all be like this. And anyway, it just went on and on. I mean, later on, and then of course we had the fourth investigation where the News of the World was interfering in the investigation, as Peter described earlier, and then nothing was done by the Met about that. And again, another provocation.
Yeah.
Another provocation.
So a small delay by the Home Secretary is deeply annoying, but it's in the scale of things.
That kind of puts, you think, well...
Puts into perspective in a way, doesn't it? Yeah.
And also I think, as I say, my opinion is, I mean, there's vast potential for suspicion all around it with her relations with the with the Conservative Party and the government's relationship with the Murdoch empire, which of course is always lurking there in the background, and a huge potential for speculation, suspicion. But as I say, my opinion is that she's been badly advised. All of the issues that she raised have been thoroughly dealt with by the panel and their lawyers and their advisors, So I hope anyway, it's just a matter of time.
It's worth saying that when I first met Alastair, I think we actually physically met in 2012 after he'd sort of ghosted me on the phone. And I think you had a wind of it. When did you actually, your mother met, sadly no longer with us, met Theresa May first in 2012, wasn't it? It was around about...
Yeah, it would have been round about that.
And then, but there was In the Wind, the panel, and when it was announced in, I think, May 2013, it was going to be 2 years.
No, first of all a year, but we knew that would never happen.
And this is now 8 years later.
How would you describe this, what you've just set out? Does somebody in that position, I mean, is cynicism the right word? Is it complete betrayal? Just what is the ultimate consequence of waking up each day feeling like the country I live in is governed by people and administrated over by just people you can't trust and who will not protect me? I mean, what is it? How would you describe your
kind of
take on it now?
Existential unease, constant. I mean, I live with it all the time. I don't feel. I mean, the only time I get any real respite from this is when I go abroad, and then I'm looking at it through the reverse side of binoculars in a way, and it looks it's farther away. It's not. I don't see on the television people that have messed me around or who I feel like have betrayed me, or indeed the shower which I regard this present day government as. But I don't, I don't trust Britain.
But just on that, as an anecdotal, he did. I think I went to the pub once with you, and you told me the story. It's in the book, but we sat in the pub around the corner from where Alastair and Kirsteen lived near Old Street, and suddenly a senior police officer appeared on TV, and Alastair started shouting at him, and he got chucked out of the pub.
Well, I did, yeah.
You were a little bit drunk, weren't you?
I was. It was just after some setback, and then this. I think it was a commissioner of police was on the television saying, "Integrity is, is a I can't remember.
A watchword or something.
Yeah, some.
And we've let our eye off the ball.
Yeah, we've taken our eye off the ball, and I just, I thought he was just, in my view, just propagandising for the British public who'd be sitting there, finest police force in the world, and all, that kind of.
I mean, it's extraordinary to say that statement. It's not surprising given everything you've been through, but that is still an extraordinary statement. I don't trust Britain. I don't trust this country of mine.
No.
And I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, in the recent weeks, the notion of corruption with regards to the political state has been sort of bandied around a lot because of Boris Johnson's wallpaper and all of these contracts going to to firms with links to the Conservative Party during the coronavirus. I mean, you wrote quite powerfully, Alastair, I think it was in 2019 for Byline Times, about the poisonous spread of corruption and how it's nothing new. But what we were finding really interesting, again, just in last week, was, a lot of people a lot of our viewers and our readers say to us, why do you describe it as cronyism? Why not corruption? And we say, well, legally, when you publish an article, you have to be very careful in terms of, because in that kind of journalistic sense, corruption is to do with a crime. But there is something to be said, surely, about a culture of corruption. And I mean, do you think we're any closer to accepting that as a country, that culturally corruption could be the bedrock of Britain?
I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to do that. I had a very long ride, to sort of get to that point. Well, no, not really, but it took, these were very, very unusual circumstances. But then, I don't know.
It does make you allergic to what you see as corruption or cronyism on the news.
Yeah.
It does make it more difficult for you
it makes you hate all forms of corruption, or you feel absolutely intolerant towards every type of it, because, and then at the moment, if you read the newspapers or you keep your eyes open and watch what's happening, you can see it's going on, and it's escalating, in my view. It's not getting things aren't getting any better. No, it's not getting, with the police, for example, I don't think there's any difference now than, only in over the past couple of days, I've been told by people that I've met about corruption in the police that they've experienced. It's not, I think possibly with the police, but then you get this kind of attitude with police and politicians and things, oh, they're all bent, aren't they? That kind of resignation that a lot of people have, I think. They just, they're all bent anyway.
You never resign?
No. Because I know, that it's not true. Because if they were all bent, then I would be gone, I would be gone. Although, of course, Brexit has stopped my freedom, taken away my freedom in that. But if they were all like that here, I would. And after what I've been through, I would be gone. I wouldn't. It'd be intolerable for me to live here.
Also, you encounter, it's a lot about media corruption, but you've also encountered a lot of good journalists. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about people like Duncan Campbell, and of course, which is this heartwarming story in the middle of this, after that second investigation, Police Complaints Authority, Hampshire Constabulary said there was no corruption. Alastair retrained as a journalist. He didn't become one, but who did he meet?
Kirsteen. Yeah, one aspect of the, and one that I want to make clear to people listening, is that I could not have done this without the exception. I've had exceptional support from my partner Kirsteen. I have a fantastic lawyer, and there have been a lot of people, including Peter here, who's done a great deal to. It felt life-saving for me doing that podcast. Sometimes you feel absolutely in despair because you think, on occasions over many years, I can't get through this, and you're banging your head against a brick wall, and you feel there's nobody out there that listens or cares. And that was a huge kind of relief for me doing that, because I felt I've got an outlet, I've got a voice. And that things like that, however strong you are, or determined in yourself, you have to, and I think you kind of make your own luck as well, right? By not giving up and keeping on, and then things happen for you.
And almost with the podcast, there was that direct connection, directly connecting to the public, and who do seem, overwhelmingly extremely supportive of your
They were always
journey.
supportive. When I first got to know them, I followed on Twitter, there was a large gang of people. You had many more followers than I did at that point, Alistair. I was looking up to you as a model of saying justice for Daniel. Who really, and they still do say, oh, keep going, mate. A lot of unionists, just people, the members of the public. But one of the things that strikes me is, the podcast was 20 episodes, having the time to explain, because it's a really complicated conspiracy.
Yeah.
And it's not a soundbite. And I think the good, like with Pod, we crowdfunded it. You have these longer forms of journalism. You could, like Netflix, you can do 10 episodes.
It was a perfect platform, because although Alastair obviously has faced problems with getting his story into the newspapers with certain organisations that employed the suspects, which didn't help, there is also a very genuine problem about his story being told in newspapers, but even more so on broadcast, where you're expected to do cover an item on a news bulletin in 30-40 seconds. You cannot tell Alastair's story in that time. And the things that are really interesting, the really juicy stuff about this murder, you have to have quite a lot of understanding before you understand why something is so dramatic and significant. That's why it doesn't work, or is it difficult to make even work in a half-hour documentary.
Yeah, I mean, Ian Overton published a piece which I think you commissioned, Hardeep, which is, in the modern world of corruption, there's no one smoking gun like the tape in Nixon's office or something. And it's not even necessarily, and maybe you think that about the Met, they have not, the subsequent commissioners have not conspired with the murder suspects, but they're drawn into this sort of tangled vein of this sort of tangled web of influence, because they're trying to cover up and protect relationships.
It spreads,
and it's very difficult to describe that without sounding crazy. I mean, you must have you said that even at college you try to start telling the story, and people begin to blank out because it's so tentacular.
Yeah.
And Peter, it's really interesting. I mean, you have been with Alastair and Kirsteen for a while now. What was so compelling for you to help tell their story, and what would you say you have learnt? It's probably very hard to sum it up, but what have you learnt?
And I must say, declaration of interest becomes some of my best friends.
I think what you were able to bring to it,
it's drama.
You looked at it as a dramatist. You thought it in scenes, and that helped tell the story in a way that's more understandable.
I saw it as a 10-part. I saw it as like The Sopranos, but with more handsome.
And Dee, of course.
And Dee was brilliant, an actor who understood the music. Her sister did the music. And I thought this is a 10-part TV series, but that's sort of cost £10 million.
But why were you so compelled to do this?
It is very funny. I don't want to get emotional again, and I always wondered why, because Alastair is great fun to be with. And he'll admit, he was in a dark way 10 years ago, and he was quite upset at times, and it's very traumatizing to relive it.
I would go so far as to say at times. I've had to have treatment for depression, I've had counselling. I mean, you don't go through this without it leaving you with some pretty deep scars, But again, as I said before, it's the support, the friends who can listen to you, and, we've got a few good friends who have supported us throughout this, and without that I would have I don't know what I would have done.
So I think that it took me a while to work out what the connection was, why I sort of empathised with this guy. He didn't even have a beard then. And Kirsteen, of course, and it was about my kid brother when he died while we were making the podcast. And there's something, he was quite prone in where he'd been ill for a long time. And I think there was something, an affinity with younger brothers, and what Alastair felt, because you feel you're part, with your parents, they look after you, and you don't expect to share a future with them because they probably, die before you. With a sibling, you have a past and you expect to share a future. And there's something, and Alastair's very poignant about keeping Daniel's shirts, how even though they lived apart, and Alastair lived in Sweden for a while, psychologically they were very close. And I think that bond, the kind of ghost of Daniel, and look, as a dramatist, it's the best detective story, because the true detective, the first true detective, is Daniel, who we're pretty convinced was investigating police corruption and trying to sell it to the press. And then there's Alastair, who becomes the second true detective, and then I'd say there's a couple more
Dave Cook, who you know was the detective hounded by News of the World, and another guy who's really interesting, Derek Haslam, who goes undercover. And I think so. It's partly venality. You know, this is a great story, but there was a psychological connection, and he plays great Swedish folk music on guitar.
Is that how you switch off?
No, that's only very, very drunken nights that happens.
But no, how do I switch off? Reading. I love to read. I read copiously now, you know.
There's nothing else to do in lockdown.
No, during the lockdown, over the lockdown, of course, you know, getting through books like this. But swimming, I find that essential for my mental health, you know, getting in the swimming pool. Yeah, these are the, you know.
Well, one bit of reading, which was going to be quite amazing for us all, is how many pages is the panel report?
It depends what size font they print it in.
The printers, I think it's something around between 12 and 1500.
That's what they've reported in the Mail,
probably,
I see.
It's probably like that.
Yes, so there's going to be a bit of reading there, and we'll obviously, whenever that's released, we'll have another special on that.
And I've just got one last question I want to ask Kirsteen, because, you know, all these years you've, you know, been by Alastair's side as this all happened. I mean, what's that experience like? That, you know,
I've only been part-time, really. I've just done the last 27, not the full 34. Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting. I never had any concept of where this would go. Because in the beginning, I never want to say it was just a murder. Obviously, a murder is always huge and traumatic, but it was a murder about one man. Then slowly it became much, much more. The corruption became bigger and wider. Then suddenly the media's involved. Then suddenly the people that one of the people that hired the suspects is working at number 10. It just grew and grew and grew. And every time you think it's nearly over, as we've learned this week, it's never been over. Hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon. Well, as Peter said, we will be coming back to look at the murder of Daniel Morgan. We will be devoting another episode of Friday Night with Byline Times when that panel report is released, which we hope it is. But for now, we're going to be coming back pretty soon for the Q&A, aren't we?
Yeah, so I thought I'd plug Patreon for you guys who want to join Alastair, Kirsteen, myself and Hardeep for any other questions you want to ask. And I want to thank David for joining our members club. And we'll see you in the Q&A. We'll be back in about 5 minutes, but we should thank Alastair and Kirsteen.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And as we said, read the book, Who Killed Daniel Morgan, listen to the podcast, Untold Murder, and thank you for watching tonight.